America's Cold War, Chapter 1, The Demise of Free Security, Part 4. Three issues of contention divided the United States from Great Britain. To begin with, Winston Churchill consistently refused to accede to the American demand that Britain respect the Atlantic Charter call for self-determination of all peoples. His principal concern was India, the jewel of the British Empire, which he had no intention of liberating. Nor did the Prime Minister express much concern about Stalin's evident desire to dominate Eastern Europe, and in particular to deny Poland its right to self-determination. In addition, the United States and Great Britain at the beginning of 1943 remained at odds on the matter of the atomic bomb. Roosevelt and Churchill had initially agreed that the project would remain a joint Anglo-American enterprise. The work was being done in America, but it relied on the historic contributions of British science and the current work of many British physicists. Yet several American officials associated with the Manhattan Project, including both Vannevar Bush and James Conant, Roosevelt's key advisors on the issue, suspected Britain of demanding greater involvement in the project merely for economic purposes, even though this increased the risk of espionage. Finally, and most important, at least during this part of the war, U.S. and British officials had been at loggerheads concerning the chief wartime objectives in Europe. Many American military officials, including Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, had pressed in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor for an invasion of occupied Europe as soon as possible. Stalin, too, wanted an Anglo-American operation from the west, through France, to relieve his beleaguered troops. Churchill disagreed. He pressed instead for peripheral objectives in North Africa and in Italy. Roosevelt dithered, but eventually took the Prime Minister's side. His rationale was that U.S. forces were not yet ready for a major campaign, and that the American people needed to experience some success in the European war before risking the enormous casualties of a Western Front invasion. Thus, while the Soviet Union waged an intense land war against the German Wehrmacht along a vast front in Eastern Europe, suffering some 10,000 casualties a day, America and Britain were fighting German and Italian forces well away from the center of the action. They were winning battles that certainly dented Nazi power and ultimately drove Italy out of the war, but these operations only put off the inevitable task of confronting German might in Western Europe. American critics of this decision saw that Churchill's larger aim in advocating the peripheral strategy was to avoid the collision of arms in Northwest Europe that would recall for the British public the interminable and intolerable trench warfare of the previous war. They also suspected that he wanted to secure the Mediterranean basin for the benefit of a post-war British Empire. Roosevelt and Churchill resolved none of these issues at their first summit meeting in Casablanca in January 1943. They were both optimistic the war would ultimately be won. Stalingrad was holding, the Japanese Navy was reeling, and it looked as though Anglo-American forces would soon secure most of North Africa. In this hopeful climate, Roosevelt and Churchill took pains to avoid conflict. They secretly approved a plan to launch a second invasion of France in 1944. This was far enough in the future to be altered or abandoned as events dictated, something Stalin, who had been promised a second front in 1942, and then again in 1943, understood all too well. They also agreed, despite Roosevelt's earlier denunciation of the deliberate bombing of urban populations, to step up the strategic air campaign against Germany, which entailed the deliberate bombing of its urban populations. Finally, they agreed to issue a public declaration that both nations would continue fighting until their adversaries agreed to unconditional surrender. That statement assured allies such as China and the Free French, the fighting force under General Charles de Gaulle working out of London, in opposition to the collaborationist Vichy government. The Vichy government was a little puppet state that took up a good bit of southern France so that Germany didn't have to do it, as well as the Soviet Union, that neither Washington nor London would accept negotiated terms with Germany or Japan. And it ensured that after the war, the Japanese and Germans could never claim they could have won it, as many Germans had maintained at the end of World War I. As the historian Gerhard Weinberg had noted, unconditional surrender appealed to Roosevelt above all else because it played to the Americans' public desire to regard the war as a moral crusade. During the 10 months between Casablanca and the first Big Three conference in Tehran in November 1943, Roosevelt acceded to Churchill more explicitly on all three issues of contention. The president toned down his criticism of British colonialism and accepted Churchill's arguments that working to deny Soviet domination in Eastern Europe would be pointless. After a lengthy internal dispute, the president countermanded his atomic advisors and ordered that Britain be included as an equal partner in the Manhattan Project. Finally, and of greatest irritation to many of military advisors, Roosevelt adhered to his private agreement with Churchill that the Second Front to be postponed until 1944, and ordered his staff to prepare, instead, to invade Italy. An American officer's assessment of the deliberations at Casablanca was representative of much military thinking during and after the conference. One might say we came, we listened, and we were conquered. Roosevelt was certainly not immune to the Prime Minister's formidable persuasive powers, and his own unwillingness to explain his motivations in any detail adds to the impression that he was indeed conquered by his British counterpart. That American foreign policy during the first 2 years of the war was largely dictated by London. But this assessment underestimates Roosevelt's ability and his view of the larger picture. The president had two basic objectives with respect to Great Britain during the middle years of the war. Foremost, he sought to keep Anglo-American relations strong and to bolster the British commitment to defeating Germany. Churchill's delay in opening a second front was an irritation, but after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, it was nothing more than that, in the larger strategic frame. Hitler was no longer in a position to defeat the USSR and move his armies to the west. So Washington and London had the luxury of choosing their own time to launch a second front. They knew they could not wait too long, for the Red Army might push further and further into Europe, with potentially dire implications for the post-war settlement. But Roosevelt wanted a British ally that would cooperate fully in the battle to liberate Western Europe when the timing was most good for them. And by agreeing to the delay, this is what he got. More broadly, Roosevelt sought to have the United States succeed Great Britain as the leader of the Western capitalist world, and replace its old imperial system with one based on free trade and decolonization. By giving in to London on issues that did not threaten this objective, and indeed by linking the two nations as closely as possible to one another militarily, the president skillfully put himself in a position to achieve this goal. For once the war moved towards its resolution in Europe, the fact of America's economic and military power would elevate the United States to a position of post-war superiority, vis-a-vis Great Britain. Irrespective of any concessions or other agreements made between Roosevelt and Churchill in 1942 and 43, Cut off at 1943. Diplomatic skill, even of the caliber possessed by Churchill, can get a nation only so far. Unlike Woodrow Wilson, a quarter-century earlier, Roosevelt would be able to insist on a post-war order from a position of commanding power. In late November 1943, delegations from the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain arrived at the capital of Iran. For what turned out to be the most important summit of the war. In 4 days of meetings, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin debated the Second Front question and hashed out the basic outline of a post-war European order. There were secret deals to parcel out spheres of influence in Southern and Eastern Europe, military and diplomatic aids coordinated strategies for defeating Hitler. Stalin, having left the Soviet Union for the first time since taking power almost 20 years earlier, made his acquaintance with the two imperialists from Britain and America. And in Tehran, Roosevelt personally began to assert U.S. predominance over Great Britain. Churchill, for his part, came to the summit with two broad aims. The first was to maintain British imperial power in the Mediterranean region, and the second was to restore a post-war balance of power. Therefore, he strongly advocated a continuing effort in southeastern Europe, proposing further invasions in the Balkans and even Turkey, where Britain had long wielded influence, even if these operations delayed the main invasion of France. At the same time, he dissented from plans to dismember Germany and France. Roosevelt would not have it. Rejecting Churchill's peripheral strategy, he assured Stalin of a spring 1944 frontal invasion of France. He accepted Soviet demands for preponderance in the Baltic states and Poland, protesting only that he could not officially accept Soviet domination over the latter for domestic political reasons. He went along with the talk of eviscerating France and Germany, even joking, after Stalin cold-bloodedly proposed executing between 50,000 and 100,000 German officers, that it might only be 49,000. FDR frequently ignored Churchill's interventions, and in front of Stalin, he even mocked the Englishman as an old-fashioned British imperialist. When the three leaders left Tehran on December 2nd, Roosevelt and Stalin had agreed on an invasion of France within a few months, a winding down of Mediterranean operations, and a post-war Europe in which the Soviet Union would be the only predominant continental power. It was a pivotal moment, not least for Anglo-American relations. British foreign policy since the Elizabethan era had been based on a balance of power in Europe, with London always taking care to ally with one side and then another to prevent domination of the continent by any one threatening state. After Tehran, the absence of a substantial ally in Western Europe left Britain with the post-war prospect of having either to contend by itself with the last remaining European power, or to ally itself with the world's other remaining giant across the Atlantic, the United States. Could there be any doubt which side Great Britain would choose? It would join with America in opposition to the Soviet Union, and it would do so in a post-war environment in which there could be no question who the senior partner was. The basic structure of this relationship was finalized during 1944. The successful D-Day invasion of France on June 6th, commanded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, spelled the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Operation Overlord, as the invasion was called, also symbolized the growing inequality of the Anglo-American relationship, since much of the invading force, not to mention almost all of the weapons and material, came from the United States. American, civilian, and military decision-makers now largely controlled Western Europe's liberation from German occupation, and after the war, they would determine the region's political fate. Economically, too, the Americans reigned supreme. A month after the invasion, the Roosevelt administration organized a conference on post-war economic planning in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at which American officials set up institutions designed to open up free trade around the world and to promote industrial development in former European colonies. These institutions would be largely funded and controlled by Americans, and they were formulated precisely to establish a new economic order to replace the previous one associated with European imperialism. Moreover, at Bretton Woods, the people at the conference agreed to make the American dollar the standard coinage of world trade, replacing the British pound sterling. By accepting these plans, London quietly transferred the mantle of hegemonic control to the United States. And by hegemonic control, it just means it owns a bunch of stuff. A low-interest loan from America to Great Britain in 1946, made with the stipulation that the British pound would be made convertible to American dollars throughout the empire, sealed that deal. End of part 4.